My wife was frozen when I told her that I wouldn't kiss her anymore, that I already knew everything about her and her lover, and that I wanted her to leave my house immediately. She didn't expect it. Not even. The eyes, which before knew exactly where to hide desire and lies, trembled like the hands that used to touch me pretending love. In that instant, her expression crumbled like a house of cards collapsing beneath the truth. The mouth, always ready to lie sweetly, opened in a screaming silence. But there was no more room for words, because I had already heard enough. And worse, I had already seen it. And nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what would follow after the discovery. What tears me apart to this day was not the stolen kiss or the body given to someone else, it was the fact that all of this was meticulously planned. It was the fact that, while I believed I was living a good phase, she was engineering my ruin. Her face, when she saw me standing in the doorway of our room that night, didn't look the same anymore. The tight dress, the hair still damp with perfume, the cell phone lying on the floor with an explicit message lighting up the screen. I didn't need any more proof. She knew that. Her silence was the loudest confession I'd ever heard. But what she didn't know, was that I had also been preparing. The smell of the wine she used to seduce, the same one she once said she hated, was still in the air. And it was there, between the pain and anger, that something inside me broke once and for all. I didn't cry. I didn't even scream. I just said, "It's over. Get out of my house." And for the first time in a long time, I saw terror in her eyes. A fear that not even she could hide. She didn't understand immediately, she didn't accept it. Her voice shook, it was choked, like someone who can't believe she's lost control of the situation. Tried to touch me. But I backed away. She tried to deny it. But I already knew. I knew about the hidden dinners, the deleted messages, the extended working hours that didn't exist, the nights when she said she was exhausted, but got ready as if she were going to live a life that wasn't like mine. And it really wasn't. She even screamed that I was crazy, that I was making it all up, that I needed help. I said I was tired of my obsession, my insecurity. She said I was suffocating her. That I made her feel invisible. And even at the height of the pain, that's when I realized the cruelty of the game she was playing. Because she knew I was a man who would give everything for love. I was the type of man who would do nothing for his family. I gave in, backed away, folded, and she used that as a weapon. She made me the villain while she left the house every night with new perfume, a smile on her face and eyes shining for another man. And yet, I was the one who felt wrong. The dirtiest thing of all is that she didn't just betray me, she tried to destroy me. He planned every step, every conversation, every rehearsed caress. It wasn't just infidelity. It was a complete act, a masterpiece of dissimulation. But what she didn't expect was that I had discovered the ultimate move. While she was pretending to love me, she was trying to kick me out of her own house. She alleged psychological abuse, forging audios and scenes in front of friends and lawyers, saying that I was an unbalanced, dangerous man, a weight in her life. She knew the house was mine. But she wanted to get me out of there. Seeing myself leaving with a suitcase in my hands and my soul in pieces. Leave me without ground, without a home, without honor. As if it were easy to erase years of loyalty with the stroke of a pen. As if it were fair. But she forgot one thing, love blinded me, yes, but betrayal woke me up. And when I woke up sharp. While she smiled in the other's arms, I had already taken the first step. I recorded it. I documented it. I watched. I would not retaliate with violence, but with coldness. The coldness that only the betrayed knows. She didn't know that her last conversation with her lover was recorded. I didn't know that her witnesses were the same ones who confided everything to me behind the scenes. And most of all, she didn't know that the messages that would incriminate me were being forged by her, and that this was a crime. When I realized how far she was willing to go, I knew there was no more room for reconciliation, for dialogue, for trying. She hadn't just crossed the line. She destroyed it with gasoline and phosphorus. And he still wanted to blame me for the fire. The cruelest part. I believed. For weeks, I wondered if I was to blame. If it wasn't me who let her escape. If it wasn't me who caused all this. But no. I loved her so intensely that I came to believe she deserved the betrayal. But no one deserves to be the target of an emotional ambush. No one deserves to sleep next to someone who is silently building their downfall. No one deserves to be called crazy by someone who lied with teary eyes and a choked voice. And the worst part, no one deserves to be manipulated to the point of feeling grateful for a caress that, deep down, was just strategy. When she understood that I knew everything, she fell to the floor. He begged. He cried. He swore love. She said she was confused. He said it was just once. He said it was a phase. He said he still loved me. He said the other one didn't mean anything. But with every word she said, there was another stab at my confidence. Her despair wasn't about regret, it was about losing control. Knowing that she had lost the game she invented. And then, when she heard my firm voice, saying that there would be no more kiss, no more hug, no more home, she trembled. Not from pain, but from terror. Because for the first time, she could no longer lie. And that's when the unexpected happened. When she tried to fight back, when she tried to turn the tables by accusing me of abuse, threatening to sue, saying she would move out of the house but bankrupt me, that's when she discovered the trap was her own. The burning in her eyes, the tense silence in the room, the phone falling out of her hand when I showed her the recording. That was more than proof. It was the moment when truth took on form, sound, color and pain. That moment frozen in time, with her unable to breathe, not knowing where to run, was the exact point at which she understood that she had betrayed herself too. And the lover? Ah, the lover. He was just there for the pleasure, for the adrenaline. I didn't know about her plan. I didn't know she wanted more than a hookup, she wanted a new life built on top of the ruins of mine. But she didn't realize he also had a secret. A secret that, when it came to light, blew everything up. A secret that not even she could bear. And it was this secret that gave me the chance not only to turn the game around, but to start over. The love she asked me for back. There was no more. The forgiveness she begged for. Neither. But there, among the ashes of everything she destroyed, I found something I never imagined existed, freedom. And when she left, someone else came into my life. In an unexpected way. With sincere eyes. With words that didn't need to be measured. With gestures that didn't need acting. And there, for the first time in years, I understood that it wasn't the end. But what did she discover about her lover, that made everything fall apart? The answer to that question lies where pain and justice intersect. Welcome to the channel. Here, we make one thing very clear, we do not support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry deep truths, because the morals are always the same: betrayal destroys. It corrodes homes, tears apart hearts and drags everyone into an abyss of pain, from which not everyone returns. Now, get ready. You're about to hear a shocking story, intense and unforgettable. Let the drama begin. Jonathan was a simple man, but with a rare essence. He had a calmness in his eyes that comforted him and in his gestures a kindness that seemed forgotten in time. At 42, he lived a stable and discreet life, built on discipline, patience and a blind faith in the power of loyalty. He was a civil engineer and spent his days between projects, meetings and visits to construction sites, but his true motivation was always to return home. And not out of attachment to home, but to the woman who waited for him. Helena. A woman with a serene presence and mature beauty, who at 39 years old carried an effortless elegance. They got married after 3 years of dating and had been together for almost a decade. They weren't the most intense or the most romantic couple in the world, but there was something between them that many envied: stability, complicity, partnership. Or at least that's what Jonathan believed. Their relationship began like so many others, shy encounters, light laughs, long conversations on the phone until they fell asleep, the enthusiasm of first touches, the delight of discovering each other's everyday details. Jonathan was enchanted by Helena's sensitivity. She was a literature teacher and spoke about books as if describing her own heart. She had a soft voice and a way of tilting her head when she smiled that made him forget about time. Helena, in turn, admired his firmness without arrogance, the silence that was never silent, and above all, the way he looked at her, as if she were the center of a world where everything made sense. In the first years of their marriage, they shared moments that left deep marks. The purchase of the new house, the renovations carried out little by little on the weekends, the impromptu dinners on the living room floor before the furniture arrived. Every wall, every painting, every crack in that house held a piece of the construction of their love. Jonathan painted with his own hands the room that would have been their unborn child, when they lost the baby in the second month of pregnancy. And even in the face of pain, it was in that silent embrace that they grew stronger. There were no accusations, no distancing. Just time, and the mutual attempt to continue loving despite the emptiness. Helena returned to teaching some time later. He resumed his routine with the same dedication as before, but Jonathan noticed that there was a new weight in it. An absence in the eyes, a distraction that didn't exist before. He believed, however, that grief had its own paths, and he never put pressure on her. He started to take more care of the details. He prepared coffee for her every day, left little notes in the books she read, planned small trips for two whenever commitments allowed. He believed that love needed maintenance, like an old house. But he never showed despair. He had confidence in the bond they had created. Jonathan's professional life was also evolving. He was promoted within the company, began to coordinate larger projects, began to be invited to lectures at universities, and, discreetly, built a reputation as a serious and reliable man. He was never the type to show off his achievements, but Helena was proud of him. He said this often, and seemed genuinely happy to see him grow up. She liked to help him choose clothes for events, organized his papers and, at times, seemed to be even more organized with his career than with her own. At the end of the year parties, they were always the first to arrive and the last to leave. Friends, co-workers and relatives looked at the two as an exemplary couple. Helena was the sweet and attentive wife, always with kind words and an available ear. Jonathan was the present, helpful, careful husband. Neither of them seemed like the type who could hurt the other. And, for that reason, people felt free to open their lives around them. They were the type of couple that served as a reference for other younger couples, which, in the eyes of outsiders, placed them on a pedestal that they both seemed to support naturally. The house they lived in was spacious, with large windows and a well-kept garden. Jonathan insisted on mowing the lawn himself, even though he could afford it. He said it was therapeutic. Helena kept pots of herbs and flowers near the balcony and liked to cook on Sundays, even if she wasn't a huge culinary enthusiast. She said that cooking for someone was a gesture of intimacy, and she did it without expecting praise. Sometimes they prepared meals together, listening to old songs, while dancing among the pots and laughter. They had a puppy named Theo, who slept at the foot of the bed, and a bookshelf full of books, many of which she had given him over the years. But there was something that, over time, began to change, in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. Helena started spending more time on her cell phone. He said it was because of the classes, the literary discussion groups, the exchanges with students. He started going out more frequently to school-related events, dinners with professional colleagues, coffee with former students. Jonathan never questioned it. He was never the controlling type. He trusted her with the same conviction as he trusted his own reason. Sometimes I would wait up, even after long days at work, just to see her walk in the door and ask how it was. She responded with tired smiles, quick kisses, and eyes that didn't look at him with the same firmness as before. He missed the old connection, but he refused to believe that time could erode something so well built. I attributed it to routine, to tiredness, to the weight of years. He tried hard to rekindle the flame, even though it seemed to be getting softer and weaker. He planned a surprise trip for the two of them, something small, just a weekend in a neighboring city, with reservations at a charming inn and candlelit dinners. She thanked him, smiled, but refused. He said he had a commitment to the students, something that could not be postponed. And he believed. I always believed. Even when it started to feel like the house was emptier, even when she started sleeping facing the other side of the bed more often, even when her laugh was lighter on the phone than with him, Jonathan believed. I believed because I loved. Because for him, love was having faith in the presence of another, even when everything seemed dark. And in this darkness, he stood firm. He continued to take care of the garden, the dog, the bills, the house. He continued to wait, with the stubborn hope that it was just a phase. But something inside him had already started to move. Little doubts took root, even though he struggled not to water them. And when he looked in the mirror, sometimes he saw a question in his own eyes that he didn't dare ask out loud. Life went on, work prospered, friends came and went, but the house, that house they built together, was starting to look like a play. Beautiful on the outside, but full of echoes on the inside. Sundays no longer had the smell of food in the air. The old songs no longer played with the same frequency. The books stopped arriving. The dog began to lie down more often in Jonathan's office than at the foot of the bed. But still, he didn't give up. He didn't want to be the man who gave up. I wanted to be the man who rebuilds, who waits, who understands. Because for Jonathan, love wasn't a contract. It was a promise made in the silence of a hug, in the heat of an early morning, in the complicity of a look. And as long as there was silence, warmth or gaze, he believed there was still hope. But what Jonathan didn't yet know, is that sometimes, hope is the ultimate betrayal. Helena started arriving later and later. At first, it was said that the school's projects were too demanding, that they had reformulated the calendar, that extracurricular events had become mandatory and that the students were more demanding than ever. Jonathan listened attentively and nodded, trying to hide the discomfort he felt every time she avoided his eyes or changed the subject quickly. The excuses, while plausible, had a strange smell to them, something he couldn't name but that echoed inside him like a warning that refused to go away. He refused to entertain that feeling. I preferred to believe in the possibility that everything was just tiredness and overload, that their world just needed some readjustment, a new fit. Deep down, he desperately wished he was mistaken. Sundays became lonely days. Helena left in the morning, citing pedagogical meetings and meetings with professional colleagues. I would spend the day out, come back with bags in my hands and perfumed hair. The eyes, however, were distant, with a fog that seemed to hide something denser. Jonathan began to watch her in silence. I noticed the details, the clothes she chose, the strongest perfume she had never used, the subtle but too careful makeup for simple work commitments. He watched and swallowed. I didn't want to be the kind of man who distrusts, who monitors, who searches pockets and cell phones. But doubt began to seep through the cracks in what they had built. One night, while she was sleeping soundly beside him, he went down to the living room, silent, with his chest tight. He sat on the sofa with his face in his hands and tried to understand at what point everything started to slip. He took out his cell phone and accessed her social media. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Old photos, interactions with friends, literary publications. But there was one detail that bothered him, the emptiness. The absence. She no longer posted anything about them. There was no photo, no mention, no gesture. It was as if he had ceased to exist there. And it was in this digital silence that anguish began to turn into real suspicion. The first concrete sign came by chance. Jonathan had forgotten his document folder at home and had to return from work early. As you entered the door, you noticed the smell of fresh coffee, the low sound of music and footsteps in the kitchen. He thought she had returned too. He called her name and heard no response. He went to the kitchen, but found it empty. The sound was coming from upstairs. He climbed up cautiously, feeling his heart racing. But when he pushed open the office door, he only found Helena sitting, quickly turning off her cell phone, and her face was slightly flushed. He said he was taking care of school matters. Jonathan smiled, kissed her forehead, and walked back to the car with the folder in his hands. But something inside him stood there, still, watching. From that day on, his footsteps became quieter. Jonathan began to mentally note the times, the smells, the looks, the objects out of place. Once, he found a packet of condoms at the bottom of the bathroom basket, among some wrapping paper. I didn't say anything. She swallowed the scream that rose to her throat and preferred to believe that it wasn't hers, that perhaps it was old, forgotten, fallen there by accident. But doubt had already sunk its claws. And once it sets in, everything becomes contaminated. The air, the words, the gestures. And as the days went by, Jonathan began to withdraw emotionally, even though he was still physically present. His smile became more restrained, his hug briefer, his speech more measured. He didn't want to confront her without proof. I didn't want to lose control of the narrative. So he decided to observe, wait, gather certainty. You had to be sure before you acted. The opportunity appeared unexpectedly. A friend of Helena's, whom Jonathan barely knew, ran into him at a coffee shop while he was reviewing blueprints and reports. She was a discreet, soft-spoken woman who seemed to know his wife well. He sat for a few minutes and, without realizing it, blurted out information that Jonathan hadn't expected to hear. She talked about a dinner at a restaurant he never knew about, a presentation that Helena had gone to with a group of friends, and the constant presence of a new classmate at school who, according to her, seemed very close to Jonathan's wife. He listened quietly, just smiling, while inside him his stomach burned. When he returned home that night, Helena was already in bed, reading. He lay down next to her, put his arm over her body and watched her for a while. She turned to him, smiled, and said she missed him. Jonathan kissed her on the forehead and responded with a "me too," but inside, his heart throbbed with disbelief. That woman, who knew every part of him, who knew his dreams, his scars, was hiding an entire world. And he was about to find out what it was. With the help of a trusted friend, Jonathan discreetly installed a small recorder in Helena's car. I didn't want to invade his privacy out of vanity or paranoia. I wanted answers. I wanted to know if I was losing my mind or if my intuition was finally telling the truth. In less than 3 days, he had confirmation. Muffled voices, complicit laughter, whispered promises. Helena spoke to someone as if she were living another romance. It was her, with her soft, sweet voice, saying things he never heard again. And it wasn't for him. Jonathan sat at his computer that night and listened to every second. He drank 2 shots of whiskey, cried in silence, and then just stared at the screen, as if he could find some explanation there that made sense. The emptiness that formed inside him was so absolute that not even the scream of pain found room to escape. It was the kind of pain that sets in like a cold blade. That doesn't scream, just cuts. A pain that invades and stays. And there, faced with the evidence, he felt that something inside him had died. But he didn't make a fuss. He didn't throw anything on the floor. He didn't confront her. On the contrary, he began to plan. He scheduled meetings outside the house, postponed appointments until the weekend, started leaving early in the morning and returning only after she had slept. Helena didn't seem to notice the change. I was immersed in another world, anesthetized by another presence, blinded by the adrenaline of escape. And Jonathan knew it. He knew she believed he would never find out, that he would never imagine. The following Friday, he prepared dinner. He set the table with candles, bought wine, made her favorite food. When Helena arrived, she smiled in surprise, praised the gesture, and said she missed it. Jonathan watched her in silence, trying to record that face one more time before destroying it forever. They ate, toasted, talked about banalities. He didn't mention anything. Just smiled. She felt safe. Comfortable. I believed everything was under control. And that was exactly what he wanted. The next morning, she left early. He said he had a talk at school and then lunch with his classmates. Jonathan waited about 30 minutes before leaving. He took the car and drove to the address he had discovered on the recorder. He parked discreetly across the street and watched. Didn't have to wait long. Helena got out of the car smiling, holding hands with another man. A smile he hadn't seen in a long time. They walked together, exchanged glances, kissed before entering the building. Jonathan closed his eyes, took a deep breath and felt the bitter taste of confirmation. He returned home and, for the first time in weeks, slept peacefully. The next night, she came back as if nothing had happened. She said she was exhausted, that it had been a long day, that she needed a shower. Jonathan just watched her. And it was at that moment, while she was gathering her hair to go up to the bedroom, that he said, in a firm and cold voice, "I'm not going to kiss you anymore. I already know everything about you and your lover. I want you to leave my house immediately." She stopped. His eyes widened, his breathing hitched, his face turned pale. Helena froze where she was. For a moment, it seemed as if time had stopped. And there, in that silence that screamed more than any words, betrayal finally took shape. But what he hadn't told her yet, was that he knew more than she imagined. Much more. Helena was motionless, her shoulders arched, her breathing short and irregular, as if her body didn't know how to react to the sentence she had just heard. Silence filled every inch of the room like a dense fog. She couldn't even turn around, she just dropped the bag from her hands, her wide eyes staring into space. Jonathan watched her with a firmness she had never seen before. There was no anger on his face, nor any explicit hurt. There was something much more frightening, a cold lucidity, like that of someone who spent too long at rock bottom and now no longer fears falling. When he repeated, in a low, sharp voice, that he wanted her to leave his home immediately, she finally turned around, with the desperate expression of someone who realizes they have just lost everything without even knowing how it started. She tried to get closer, tried to touch his hand, stammered his name between sobs, but Jonathan took a step back and, in a tone that mixed contempt with surgical precision, said that there was no longer room for any gesture from her in there. It was at that moment that Helena began to beg. The posture that until then was arrogant and confident melted. She cried like a child, saying she was lost, that she had made a mistake, that she didn't know what was happening to her. His voice was choked, his face contorted and stained with tears. She tried to explain that the other man meant nothing, that it was just an escape, that she still loved him, that she wanted to fight for the marriage. Jonathan listened to everything in silence, his eyes fixed on her like someone watching a theater scene that he already knows by heart. And then, when she knelt before him and held his leg tightly, he finally spoke firmly, "You tried to destroy me. It wasn't just betrayal, Helena. It was manipulation. It was cruelty. It was a strategy. But what you don't know is that I also prepared myself. And now it's your turn to listen." He bent down to her level, looked into her eyes coldly and said, "You accused me of emotional abuse in an email sent to your lawyer. You said you were afraid of me. That I controlled you. That I wanted to leave the house because you felt threatened. I read everything. You were trying to get me out of the house I bought years before I met you. You wanted to kick me out of my own life. But you made a mistake. You sent the message from the same cell phone where you recorded the chopped-up audios that pretended to be fights between us. But you didn't know that I was already monitoring everything. I found out before you managed to file any complaints." Helena's expression changed. Desperation gave way to panic. He tried to deny it, he tried to justify himself, he said he had been confused, that it was an outburst sent in a moment of anger. But her voice was shaking. The hand sought support, as if trying to grab the air. Jonathan continued, without raising his tone, but letting each word weigh like a sentence. "You recorded your speeches alone. You created discussions that never happened. You put your cell phone on to record while you shouted at me alone in the room. Then you cut the beginning and the end and said it was proof. You planned a narrative. You were going to use that to get me out of the house, take everything away from me and still come out as a victim. I just didn't count on the fact that the hidden microphone in the office recorded it too. You yourself said that you would destroy me legally if I found out about your lover. And that, if everything went well, it would still come out as martyr. Helena fell into a sitting position, her legs gave out. The face no longer found expression, just a mask of absolute terror. Jonathan got up, went to the closet and came back with a folder in his hands. He opened it and began to take out the papers. Printed images, audio transcriptions, copies of emails. Silently, he spread the documents out on the dining table. It was a timeline. The meetings with the other man, the messages exchanged, the emails to the lawyer, the schedules incompatible with the apologies, the audio edits. Everything there. Documented. Organized. Annoyingly meticulous. As if he had spent months putting together that puzzle in secret. Helena didn't say anything. He just watched with wide eyes. When he reached for one of the sheets, Jonathan grabbed his wrist firmly and said, "This evidence is already with my lawyer. You're going to leave here without a penny. You're going to sign the separation on my terms. And you're going to leave now." She stumbled to her feet, saying that it couldn't be like that, that it was unfair, that he was being cruel. He started screaming, crying loudly, as if someone was going to appear and stop him. But Jonathan no longer reacted. He was calm, standing in the center of the room, waiting. Helena went up the stairs, hurriedly grabbed some clothes and came down with a suitcase in her hands, her eyes red, her breathing uneven. When he passed him, he tried one last appeal. She said she still loved him, that it was all crazy, that they could talk. Jonathan responded with just a look. And that's when she made the final mistake. In a fit of despair, she dropped her suitcase on the floor, pointed her finger at him and shouted, "You're not better than anyone. You're not the saint you think you are. And you know what? He's better than you in everything. At least he makes me feel alive." The voice echoed through the house, filled with hatred. Jonathan stared at her in silence, the muscles in his face inert, his eyes without any emotion. And then, slowly, he opened the door. Helena staggered past him. But before leaving, he turned and said, in a low voice, almost a whisper, "You destroyed my life." Jonathan responded without hesitation, "You did it alone." She left. Inside the house, silence reigned again. Jonathan didn't cry. He walked slowly to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, sat down on the chair and remained there for long minutes. But it wasn't peace he felt. It was a dense, cold, strange void. The truth had been revealed. Her mask had fallen off. The humiliation she planned for him was now hers. But still, something inside him hurt unbearably. Not because of the loss. But for having loved someone capable of that. The phone rang. It was the lawyer. Jonathan answered, exchanged a few words and hung up. The separation would continue without obstacles. Everything went as expected. But deep down, he knew. That wasn't the last surprise. There was still something in the air, something that she was trying to hide and that wasn't in the papers or in the recordings. Something that explained the fear in her eyes. And that, in the coming days, would come to light with more force than any betrayal. He didn't know what it was. But I knew that Helena wasn't finished yet. And what she feared most, was about to be revealed. The next morning, Jonathan woke up to a different silence. The house no longer felt just empty, but light, as if an invisible tension had finally dissolved into the air. The room where before the muffled sound of lies was hidden between sheets now seemed like a neutral space, disinfected from the presence that tortured him. He stood up slowly, not because he was tired, but because his body was still trying to understand the change. For the first time in weeks, he drank coffee without rushing, opened the windows without expectation, observed the garden as if looking at an abandoned land. But what he didn't know was that what was coming would no longer be silence. It would be a storm. And not because of the woman he had kicked out of his life, but because of the plot she had left behind. 3 days later, while he was organizing some documents in the office, the intercom rang. The doorman's voice sounded neutral, as always. A woman wanted to speak to him. She didn't want to give her name, but said it was urgent. Jonathan hesitated for a few seconds before allowing entry. He walked to the door, opened it, and there she was. Not Helena, but a woman with short hair, fair skin, tense eyes. The appearance was familiar, but he didn't recognize it immediately. She introduced herself as Clara, lawyer for a woman called Denise, a name that also didn't mean anything to her. But within seconds, she revealed what would change everything. Denise was the ex-wife of the man with whom Helena had the extramarital affair. And the reason for the visit was a series of documents and records that, according to Clara, involved not only adultery, but also fraud, misrepresentation and, surprisingly, Helena's signature on contracts that could put Jonathan at risk. Jonathan invited her in and listened intently as she explained. The man, whose name was Rodrigo, had convinced Helena to open a joint account to hide his assets in the name of third parties. Apparently, Helena, blinded by the illusion of the new romance, signed documents as a foreman in deals involving high values, simulated purchases of luxury vehicles, undeclared transfers, and falsification of bank receipts. Helena didn't seem to know everything, but she was aware enough to become an accomplice. And as Jonathan's bank details appeared in old records shared with her, he could be legally involved if the investigation progressed. Clara explained that her client, Denise, had been gathering evidence for months to incriminate her ex-husband and that, upon discovering Helena's involvement, she was horrified to realize that a woman had entered this web not only as a lover, but as a blind accomplice. Jonathan listened in silence, trying to take in the complexity of the situation. It wasn't just about betrayal. It was about manipulation on levels he never imagined possible. Helena didn't just betray him emotionally, she put his safety, his reputation, and his name at risk. He asked why Clara had come to him, and the answer came firmly, because they knew he was innocent and had probably been deceived as much as everyone else involved. Denise didn't want revenge, she wanted justice. And she believed that Jonathan could help her take down Rodrigo with the evidence he himself had already gathered against Helena. In the evening of that same day, Jonathan sat in front of the fireplace, holding copies of the documents that Clara had left him. It was strange to see his signature, his identity tied to a tangle of frauds that he was completely unaware of. Helena had used her trust, not just to hide a lover, but to infiltrate her professional life, her CPF, her accounting. Over time, she had stolen more than his peace, she stole his innocence. And now, her name appeared as legal representative in 2 purchase and sale contracts for luxury cars purchased with money he didn't even know existed. The next day, he decided to look for Helena. He needed to confront her, understand where this was going, and most importantly, he needed her to sign a liability release, freeing him from any ties to the contracts. He called the number she still used. The voice on the other end answered cautiously. She looked surprised. He asked why he was calling. Jonathan was direct, "I need to talk to you. And it's not about love, nor about forgiveness. It's about something much more serious. If you still care about your freedom, you'll meet me today." She hesitated, tried to say that she didn't want to see him anymore, but he just hung up after giving her the address. A discreet cafe, away from prying eyes, is the setting chosen for the final confrontation. Helena arrived late. It was different. Swollen eyes, pale face, hair tied up in a mess. She wore a loose coat, as if trying to hide from herself the woman she had once been. He sat down without saying anything. Jonathan slowly placed the papers on the table and asked, "Do you know what this is?" She recognized it immediately. The silence that followed was devastating. Then, in a whisper, she said, "I didn't know it was that serious." Jonathan responded calmly, "You didn't know, or did you choose not to know?" She closed her eyes, took a deep breath and confessed that Rodrigo had said it was just a loan between friends, an accounting move to avoid taxes. He never suspected there was a crime. Or rather, he was suspicious, but preferred not to question it. I was too involved. Too blind. He watched her, almost with pity. He asked her why she did that. Why risk everything? Why throw away a marriage, a life? Helena cried. She said Rodrigo made her feel alive. That made her feel wanted, heard, admired. He said Jonathan was very good, but cold. That she felt she was invisible. That he needed to remember who he was. But as he spoke, his voice shook not with emotion, but with shame. Because now, there were no more justifications. Just ruins. And Jonathan, firmly, just replied, "You cheated on me with a man who used you. And in the process, tried to destroy me too." She tried to defend herself, but he interrupted her. "You have two options, either sign this and free me from any ties to this scheme, or I turn everything over to the police with your name included. The choice is yours. But don't think you will have my compassion." Helena signed the papers in silence. Then he got up, tried to touch him once more. Jonathan backed away. He said she had crossed lines that could no longer be fixed. She left the cafe with heavy steps, her eyes lost, like someone walking without a destination. Jonathan stayed there for a few minutes, breathing, allowing the last memory of her to fade away with the smell of coffee and the noises of the street. In the following days, Jonathan handed the documents to lawyer Clara. Denise took action against Rodrigo. The investigation intensified. And Jonathan, finally, felt he had freed himself. But destiny sometimes delicately rewards what chaos tried to destroy. One Saturday morning, while visiting a bookstore to give a gift to his niece, he met someone. A woman with a calm smile, a firm voice, who approached him asking if he needed help choosing a contemporary novel. The meeting was brief, but it left marks. Her name was Laura. And there, in that almost banal simplicity, something different lit up. Jonathan wasn't ready for new love. But he was ready to look someone in the eye without fear. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could take a deep breath without fear of being stabbed around the next corner. Time passed. And the case against Rodrigo took place. Helena disappeared from the radar. There were no more connections, no messages, no news. It was as if it had evaporated. But Jonathan knew that the damage she had done to herself was greater than the damage she had done to him. Now, everything was where it should be. The lies had been exposed, the papers signed, the truths exposed. But deep down, even with everything resolved, Jonathan knew that some wounds don't heal. They just heal over time. And as he walked out of that bookstore, with a book in his hands and a new number saved in his cell phone, he realized that sometimes the real beginning is not with someone else, but with who we are after surviving the worst. In the days that followed the definitive meeting with Helena, the world seemed to reorganize itself around Jonathan with an almost melancholy slowness. There were no more confrontations, no abrupt revelations, no unavoidable urgencies, but that did not mean that the wounds had been healed. The silence in the house was now true, no longer filled with suspicion, but still deafening. It was as if, after all the storm, there was only the echo of a life that he no longer recognized as his own. The paperwork was resolved, the evidence was delivered, the bonds were broken, but there was something that still weighed inside him, a kind of void that justice was unable to fill. He often found himself sitting on the porch, with his eyes lost in the garden, trying to understand how a love he believed to be solid and pure had turned into such a carefully constructed trap. He felt like a war survivor, alive, yes, but different, with invisible marks spread across his body and soul. Returning to work was like diving into another reality, where none of that existed. Colleagues greeted him cordially, projects demanded his attention, deadlines once again dictated the rhythm of the hours. Jonathan threw himself into his work with discipline but without passion. He was functional, precise, but he felt like a part of him was missing from everything he did. Trust in people, even those closest to us, had been deeply shaken. The words lost some of their weight, the gestures seemed masked by hidden intentions. He didn't show it, but his gaze was always looking for signs, for cracks, for small signs that something might be hidden. The trauma of having been manipulated so deeply by someone in whom I had absolute trust left subtle but profound consequences, which were revealed in the small choices, in the moments of hesitation before taking a step, in a kind of permanent emotional recalibration. Meetings with Laura, still shy and sporadic, became a kind of silent refuge. She was intelligent, reserved, and seemed to realize, even without him saying it, that something inside him was still rebuilding. He never pressured him for answers, nor did he ask invasive questions. What appeared between them was light, almost ethereal, but gained shape over time. Every conversation, every shy laugh, every shared silence gave Jonathan the feeling that maybe it would be possible, one day, to love again without the fear of being destroyed by it. Laura didn't remember Helena at all. And perhaps that was the biggest relief. She was opposite in presence, in tone of voice, in intensity. There was a serenity about her that Jonathan didn't know he needed until he experienced it. Meanwhile, the investigation against Rodrigo progressed at a speed that surprised even the lawyers. Clara kept Jonathan informed frequently. Helena's involvement in the contracts, although real, was overshadowed by the number of crimes attributed to the real mastermind of the fraud. Rodrigo had used several women as fronts for illegal businesses and, thanks to Jonathan's testimony and the evidence he had provided, the public prosecutor's office was about to close a collaboration agreement with other accomplices. Helena, who until then had not been officially denounced, now ran the risk of being called to testify. This gave Jonathan a strange feeling of justice mixed with discomfort. He didn't want her in prison, he didn't take pleasure in imagining her being judged publicly, but he also knew that his actions had consequences. This was the dilemma that gnawed at him: to what extent should he interfere or let life itself take care of the punishment? Justice, in its objective coldness, does not measure the moral weight of intentions. But he did. During a sleepless night, Jonathan woke up to a message on his cell phone. It was from an unknown number, with no name. The text simply said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know how much I could lose." The screen stayed lit in his hand for minutes until he locked the device and threw it on the bedside table. He didn't respond. I knew it was Helena. And he also knew that this was not a request for forgiveness. It was a sigh of despair. A late call from someone who only saw the abyss when it was already falling. Jonathan refused to be the safety net that would stop the fall. As much as he still felt, behind the anger and disappointment, remaining traces of old love, he knew that it was no longer up to him to save her. In the following days, he received another unexpected visitor. Denise, Rodrigo's ex-wife, asked to meet him in person. They made an appointment in a discreet park, where they could talk away from prying ears. She was a strong woman, with tired but firm eyes, who carried in her eyes the same kind of pain that Jonathan knew well. They talked at length about what they had been through, about how two different relationships became intertwined in the worst possible fate. Denise said that Helena had already been formally summoned in the process and that the lawyers anticipated that she would be called to testify. What Jonathan didn't expect was what Denise said next: that Helena had tried to sign an agreement to free Rodrigo from the most serious accusation, claiming that she was the one who had authorized the financial transactions. He tried to turn the game around once again. But the lawyers were prepared. The evidence of role reversal, messages, and audio between the two completely overturned any forged narrative. Still, Helena's gesture revealed that she remained willing to manipulate, even in the face of absolute chaos. Jonathan listened to everything with a lump in his throat. The feeling that was growing inside him was no longer anger, but a kind of prolonged mourning. The woman he had cried for was no more. Maybe it never really existed. There was a version of her that he had idealized, supported, protected with every part of himself. And now, all that was left was the effort to understand how he survived for so long with someone who nurtured a secret universe of intentions. He returned home after that conversation feeling tired that wasn't physical. I needed to make a decision. Either he would close this story once and for all, or he would continue to be dragged by it. That night, he called Clara and asked if he could remove his name from any possible connection with the rest of the case. She tried to convince him that his collaboration was important, but he explained that his desire was just to completely disengage, disappear from that scenario, close the door, turn off the light and leave. Clara understood. Respected. He assured that he would do what was necessary. Jonathan hung up the call with a bittersweet feeling of freedom. I knew that this was not an act of escape, but of protection. He had done his part. He had faced what he needed to face. Now, I just wanted to start over in peace. Over time, visits to the bookstore became more frequent. He and Laura started seeing each other more regularly. There were no promises, no declarations. But there was care. She was not a woman of grand gestures, but of consistent presence. He showed up when he said he would come, he listened more than he spoke, he had a discreet smile that always appeared at the right moments. Little by little, Jonathan realized that something inside him was beginning to breathe differently. I no longer looked for signs of danger in every word, I no longer avoided touch or looked away. He was relearning to trust. Not just in her, but in himself. On a rainy afternoon, Laura invited him to her house for coffee. It was a modest place, but full of details that spoke about who she was. Books stacked in unlikely corners, old photographs, hand-painted pictures, mismatched porcelain cups. They talked for hours, as if time had stopped running. At the end of the day, before they said goodbye, she said that she didn't want to pressure him, but that she was happy with what they were building. Jonathan smiled, touched her hand gently and replied that he was too. For the first time, he didn't feel afraid when he said it. And so, without realizing it, the rubble of the past began to give way to a new structure, lighter, more sincere, unhurried. Jonathan didn't want any more answers. He no longer sought to understand what motivated Helena, nor what could have made him see before. I knew that I had learned in the cruelest way possible, but that I had learned nonetheless. And as I walked home that night, I felt like something important was about to happen. Not a new trauma, not a new confrontation. But the definitive end of a cycle that insisted on leaving doors ajar. What he still didn't know was that Helena hadn't accepted the end as easily as he thought. And something in his behavior, in his sudden absence and in the messages he no longer responded to, indicated that the end of that story would still have a final chapter. A chapter that would not be written with the same fury as the previous ones, but with an impact that would surpass any emotional limit Jonathan believed he had ever experienced. The weeks that followed were marked by a disconcerting feeling of waiting, as if something was suspended in the air, about to fall with weight and noise. Jonathan had finally managed to get his routine back. The name was clean, the links with the legal process had been officially ended, and Helena seemed to have disappeared completely. There were no more messages, no more attempts to contact, no more whispers in common groups of friends. It was as if she had evaporated from his life and everyone around him. But that absence, instead of representing relief, started to represent something else, uncertainty. Jonathan didn't want anything to do with her, but he knew she wasn't the type to accept the end with resignation. Something inside him insisted that this was not the end. There was a final layer of pain hidden somewhere, and he hadn't reached it yet. One Saturday morning, Laura invited him to visit a contemporary art exhibition. She knew he wasn't a big fan of the genre, but she did it with that light tone that was already typical of her, as if suggesting without pressuring. Jonathan accepted. He needed to leave the same circle of places, break with the invisible traces that still linked his mind to the past. During the visit, as they walked among abstract paintings and sculptures that looked like enigmas, Jonathan realized he was at peace. For the first time since the collapse of his marriage, he felt integrated into the moment. There was no internal surveillance, no armor erected. Just the present. Laura spoke with enthusiasm, pointing out elements in the works with her eyes shining, and he, silent, watched her as if watching something reborn. But that serenity was abruptly interrupted by a phone call. The number was unknown, the tone of the call was urgent. On the other end of the line, a woman's voice introduced herself as the head nurse of a private hospital. He said he needed to confirm whether he was a relative of Helena Leaves. Jonathan's heart raced immediately, not because of the possibility of physical harm, but because something in the nurse's tone revealed that the problem was deeper. He confirmed his identity, asked what had happened and heard, on the other side, that Helena had been rushed to hospital after a collapse in a motel in the North Zone, apparently alone, without documents. She was identified only because, before losing consciousness, she had shouted his name, asking for help. Jonathan felt a knot form in his stomach. Laura, who noticed his sudden paleness, came over and asked if everything was okay. He hesitated, looked at her and told the truth. For the first time, he found it difficult to balance the delicacy of the new with the weight of the old. Laura didn't say a word. He just nodded and suggested he go. The tone was understanding, but there was a discreet pain there, like someone who sees someone else's shadow cast over a space that was being carefully reconstructed. At the hospital, Jonathan found Helena unconscious, on life support, with a pale face and dry lips. There was a brutal silence in that room. She was fragile, unrecognizable, so far removed from the controlling, intense woman who had manipulated him. Next to the bed, a folder with personal belongings. The doctor came in and explained that she had ingested a large amount of anxiolytics mixed with alcohol, and that although there were no definitive signs of a suicide attempt, the context indicated that it might not just be an accidental overdose. Jonathan remained there for hours. Not out of pity. Not because I still love her. But because there was something that needed to be closed, said, resolved with presence, not with distance. When Helena woke up, her eyes took a while to focus. But upon recognizing him, a tear slowly fell. She tried to speak, but her voice broke. Jonathan approached and said, calmly, you need to take care of yourself. This isn't about me, it's about you. Helena turned her face away, but her shoulders shook. After a few minutes, in an almost imperceptible whisper, she confessed something he hadn't expected. He said Rodrigo had disappeared. That after the investigations tightened, he had left the country, and she had been left with debts, threats and fear. She said she was alone, that no one else attended to her, that friends had moved away, that the lawyers considered her a burden in the process, a disposable piece. That she began to live favorably in the homes of acquaintances, until everyone began to avoid her name. And that morning, when she woke up in that dirty motel room, she understood that there was no one else in the world she could call, except him. Jonathan listened to her in silence. She didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't beg for a return. She just spilled her raw truth, like someone who, for the first time, had been confronted by herself. He got up, picked up the folder with his documents and said that he would leave everything organized for his discharge, but that he could not, nor did he intend, to do more than that. He also said that he hoped that, for the first time, she would face reality without masks. She didn't react. He just nodded with teary eyes. On the way out, she left a contact number for an NGO that helped women in situations of emotional and financial collapse. He said it was the most he could offer. In the following days, Jonathan heard nothing more about her. He didn't try to find out. But what Helena had said in that hospital bed continued to echo. The dilemma he now faced was no longer about her, nor about love, nor about betrayal. It was about humanity. To what extent could he move forward, fully, knowing that someone, no matter how bad it was sinking in their own pain without any support? What did justice mean when it was confused with abandonment? Laura noticed the change in his face. She asked him one night, gently, if he still had anything from his ex-wife. Jonathan responded honestly, it's not about carrying anymore, it's about what to do with what's left. Laura, with her usual sensitivity, said she didn't have all the answers, but she understood the conflict. And that, regardless of his decision, the important thing was that she didn't feel like he was his second option. Jonathan assured him it wasn't. And in that moment, he realized how much he had changed. The man who had once forgiven too much, ignored signs, believed blindly, was now a man who recognized limits, who valued true presence, who did not confuse empathy with relapse. One afternoon, when visiting the NGO that he had recommended to Helena, he discovered that she had made contact. She was receiving psychological support, participating in support groups and being assisted by a social worker. The coordinator said she was fragile, but cooperative. She cried a lot, but didn't complain. That he had lost everything, yes, but he still had some hope. Jonathan thanked him for the information and, before leaving, left an envelope with a small anonymous donation. It wasn't charity. It wasn't rescue. It was just a gesture. A final gesture from someone who chose to be righteous, even when the world around them chose otherwise. Back at home, he found Laura sitting on the sofa, reading. She looked at him, and he knew he didn't need to say anything. He sat down next to her, held her hand and remained there, in silence. There was no more noise, no weight, no ghosts. Just two whole people, even if broken inside at some point, willing to carry on. And at that moment, Jonathan understood that the real end of pain didn't come when the other person disappeared, but when you no longer needed to hate him to continue living. The last time Jonathan heard any concrete news about Helena was through a short, cold report, the kind that passes without fanfare on the inside pages of a local newspaper. The headline talked about an accusation of false testimony in cases involving money laundering, and her name appeared among others, without prominence, without sensationalism, like one of many faces involved in a scandal that lost strength over time. He read that news with the strangeness of someone watching an earthquake from a distance that one day almost took him off his feet. He felt neither pity nor relief. He just felt certain that everything was, finally, far enough away to no longer reach him. Helena had crossed a line that took her to a place from which she might never return. It wasn't prison, nor public humiliation, which felt like punishment to her, it was oblivion. She disappeared from social media, from social circles, from the lives of anyone who had ever believed in her version of herself. It was alive, but invisible. And perhaps this would be the biggest consequence for someone who has always lived off attention, subtle manipulation and the constant need to control narratives. There was no more stage. And without a stage, Helena became silent. Rodrigo, on the other hand, wasn't even that lucky. He ended up located in a neighboring country on an international warrant and extradited months later. The trial was brief. The evidence was as irrefutable as the widespread contempt he caused in everyone who knew him. He received a heavy sentence, lost assets, credibility and freedom. The charm, the talk, the charisma, everything dissolved before the bars and time. During the process, he tried to involve Helena again, accusing her of being one of the minds behind the scheme, but her defense managed to prove that, despite being an accomplice in part, she had also been one of the many pieces manipulated by him. Still, Rodrigo never showed remorse. In the few videos recorded during the trial, he maintained a cold smile, like someone who still believed he was the owner of the game. But no one else was playing. Denise, in turn, continued her life with the firmness of someone who spent too long being underestimated. She opened a small financial consultancy aimed at women who had been through abusive relationships and built their independence with an energy that was impressive. He became an active voice in public campaigns and his story, despite his painful past, became a symbol of overcoming. He maintained contact with Jonathan for a while, especially during the legal proceedings, but little by little they both understood that that connection had been born out of the trauma and that, once it was overcome, there was no room for emotional continuity. Still, mutual respect remained intact, like two souls who recognized each other at rock bottom, but chose to climb alone to reach the surface. As for Laura, she remained. Not as a heroine, nor as a replacement for an old love, but as a whole woman, willing to walk alongside someone without wanting to be destiny. Their relationship evolved at its own pace, without rushing, without fears disguised as promises. Jonathan learned to love maturely, with his eyes open, without idealizations. And Laura, with her serene calm, knew how to respect the scars without touching them with pity. Their relationship was built not from pain, but despite it. They learned to celebrate simple days, Sunday afternoons, silent cafes, complicit glances. There was no longer any need for a spectacle. And perhaps because of that, love blossomed with a strength that Jonathan never imagined experiencing again. Jonathan, now in a new home, simpler, clearer, less marked by old memories, started again. He continued working, but slowed down. He eventually started teaching technical courses, sharing his experience with young people who saw in him more than a teacher. They saw a man who knew what reconstruction was. He didn't talk about Helena, nor about what he went through. But those who really knew him realized that there was a different depth to him, as if he had walked through a fire and emerged on the other side with more attentive eyes and a more prudent heart. I no longer believed in universal happy endings, but in just endings. And what he built was fair. Last fall, as he walked through the park where he used to meet Laura, he saw a woman sitting alone on a bench, staring at the lake. For a moment, he thought it was Helena. His heart pounded, his breathing failed, but as he got closer he realized she was just a stranger. Still, he was paralyzed for a few seconds, until Laura appeared and held his hand. He smiled, relieved, and then he knew he was finally free. Free from shadows, triggers, guilt and the need to understand what could never be explained. Some questions have no answer. Some people have no redemption. And that's okay. Deep down, Jonathan understood that forgiveness is not about absolving another. It's freeing yourself from what the other caused. It's about no longer carrying rubbish that isn't yours. And that's what he chose. Follow. Whole. Serene. With the dignity of someone who was betrayed, but did not allow himself to be reduced to treason. With the courage of someone who looked the truth in the face and chose not to return the blow with hatred, but with reconstruction. And with the maturity of someone who knows that, even when love dies, life doesn't have to die with it. If you made it this far, tell me in the comments what you thought of this story. Do you believe that some people change? Or are there betrayals that cannot be returned? I really want to know your opinion. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, take the opportunity now to subscribe and activate the bell. Here you will find impactful, moving stories that show reality as it is. But always with one certainty, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Until next time.